All right. Hello again, everyone. We're back here at the Scholar and Gentleman and living rooms around the country to discuss Book 2 of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. I don't know about you guys, but I thought this is a really entertaining book. It's one of the funniest sections in the book, and yet also starting to delve into some of the bigger ideas. So a lot happened. The action kind of kicks right in there. So I wanted to open up for people's initial reactions. And then I've got some more specific questions to dive in deeper. But, how did you find this section? Any particular highlights for you? General reactions. We'll start right there.
I wonder if it might be helpful if we just did like a quick recap of like the 60,000 foot overview of the section that we're talking about.
Michael didn't do the reading.
Oh, I did do the reading. I just did it a month and a half ago and skimmed through it again. But I think that would just like kind of help segue into the discussion, just on a general basis,
Right. And I will actually confess that this week I finished this entire book. And in the last hour and a half tried to scream through this section again. And I made it most of the way, but not all the way. So does anyone else want to volunteer an overview? I'll do one.
Family drama.
So in book one, we basically had backstory on the family dysfunction of the Karamazovs and all the brothers and their upbringing and how terrible their dad was, basically. And in book two, we have
the Maury Show.
Yeah, pretty much. It really is like 19th century Maury Povich. So the Dmitri and his father Fyodor are basically having a feud about Dmitri's inheritance, which he believes he's been robbed of, where Fyodor says, I've already given you all that money in bits and pieces, and in fact, actually, now you owe me. And for some reason, the idea comes up that they should go before the elder at the monastery, and that maybe in his presence they can come to some sort of reasonable agreement. So the book begins with them showing up at the monastery. Almost immediately, Pyotr Miasov and Fyodor begin to quibble and feud with each other. There's a pretty comical scene before the elder. Then there's a chapter or two where the elder goes and visits pilgrims who are there to see him, some who have faith, and then a woman who has a lot of questions and doubts. He comes back in. Dmitri finally shows up. There's a giant squabble and scene and total scandal where they find out these two men are really fighting over a woman that they're both in love with who is living with an old man as a kept woman. And there's general scandal. Fyodor pretends to leave the monastery, but the others go on to dinner. And then Fyodor changes his mind, comes back in and says, hey, I'm here, and does everything possible to provoke everyone until they all have to leave in disgrace, basically. So there's my summary. I want to welcome Emmy. I see you just signed on. Are you there, Emmy? Well, maybe not. Anyway, so there's my little summary. Does anyone want to chime in with, your first impression of this section? Highlights, amusing sections. We'll dig more into some of the characters and themes and so forth in a minute.
I have a bunch of specific things, but not any I don't know if I had processed an overall feeling, but something that really struck me is how much the father strikes me like my bipolar uncle. And like yesterday, I was at the store buying beer for my coworkers to watch football, and this homeless guy's behind me in line, reeking of cigarettes and booze, and just is telling me his life story that I didn't ask about. He has that kind of an ethos that just is so uncomfortable and so awkward. I can just feel everyone's toes clenching every time he talks.
You never know what he's going to say.
Yeah, he's entertaining in the extreme. I find him hilarious and maddening at the same time. If you're viewing from a distance, it's easy to like him as like a comic character. If you're actually trying to do anything with him, it's absolutely infuriating.
Oh man, that totally fits my sister the other day, who of course is not reading this book with us, but just the other day posted on Facebook something like, I like a lot of characters who are horrible people, but well-written and entertaining characters, but that doesn't mean I like horrible people. Yeah. And kind of vice versa, just because, that also works for heroes of the story who have huge flaws. Like, they can be well-written and well thought out and entertaining, and I like them, but I wouldn't necessarily like that person if I knew them in real life. I think that totally applies here.
It almost reminds me of someone off of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia or something like that. For those of you who watch terrible, horrible television.
I've never seen that, but yeah.
Check your tone. There's like 6 great seasons of that show.
I'm going to leave it open for just a second. If we want, I can ask some questions about Fyodor that I've thought of. But if anyone else has some initial reactions first about other parts.
Yeah, I was going to say that as much as Fyodor is like the buffoon, is like the most clownish of all of the characters in this book. Each of the central characters seems to also like make a fool of themselves in their own particular way. Musov is like so concerned about everybody else's opinions of him, and he keeps trying to like figure out some way to like save face, and is just making everything worse. And is like fighting back against Fyodor, which just makes everything worse, which just, encourages him. And there are just these moments where you just like feel the elder just like kind of take a step back and be like, whoa, like you guys are just I don't know what to do with you guys.
I'm going to pull the car over until you guys settle down.
Yeah. And even Alexei and Ivan, like they're not saying much in this book, but in their own particular ways. Ivan or Ivan is the things that he does say, like he's kind of making an ass of himself in his like intellectual way. The only things that he says are to like provoke intellectual fights, and Alexei's just sitting there like completely embarrassed and can't like play the role that he wants to play as the mediator, moderator, the one who makes everybody happy, because getting everybody into this one place just like makes everything as bad as it possibly can be.
Anyone else want to add some reactions? Okay. I think while we're talking about Fyodor, there's a couple interesting points to bring up, or questions we could ask and talk about. One that just occurred to me, in a lot of literature, you have Shakespeare, for instance, the idea of the truth-telling fool. You know, the one who is sort of a clown, but somehow ends up saying something that's true. Is there any of that quality in Fyodor? And you know, he starts kind of confessing himself to the elder. Do you think the elder has understood something of Fyodor's soul? Do you think that Fyodor believes the elder has gotten some of his inner portrait right, you know, or is he just messing around with everyone? I'm curious to know what people think about that.
I think the elder said something like, "A man who lies to himself is the first to take offense," or something. But I think he hit at the essence of, you know, of at least parts of who Fyodor is, but I'm not sure that his narcissism would like let that reflect into himself. And I mean, I feel like he's saying whatever is advantageous for his, you know, instantaneous gains all the time. I don't know.
Well, I think too, like right along with that, one of the lines that seemed really important to me is right after the Father Zosimus says that, he also says to him, above all, don't be so ashamed of yourself, or something like that, right? Like that's the heart of it all, is acting out of shame. And one of the things I was thinking as we were talking about Fyodor is he's the most obviously buffoon-like, but I don't think at heart he's all that different. Like I just quickly reread through this section today too, and I was noticing like so many of the characters, kind of this is what you were saying, David, are playing a role, right? Like when we start to talk about, is it Elise, the little girl who's like messing with Alyosha, and her mother who's like playing like there's so many characters that each have like found a role and they're playing it, and it all seems to come out of sort of shame or not really being sure of themselves. So it was interesting to me to think about how Fyodor might be the most exaggerated and extreme, but in some ways he's really just the other thing that like about the truth-telling fool is I feel like Fyodor keeps saying these lines that just seem like really accurate to a lot of people. Like it's sometimes pleasant to take offense, or it's like beautiful to like just get really angry and worked up about something and run with it, or like it's possible to totally know you're being an idiot and keep doing it all the time. And it's weird because he's at once the most ridiculous and the most self-aware of something it seems everyone's doing at some level. He's just the one that will take it to 11, you know, like fine, I'll do it to the point where everything breaks down. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think he's the most honest about lying.
But the way it struck me actually was kind of like people. Are we worried about language on this
No.
posting? Okay. Since we're live, I thought I'd ask.
Are you going to take it to 11?
Post of like I just saw on Facebook some, you know, meme or something that's like, oh, I'm just a bitch, and if you can't handle it, too bad. Which, like, on the one hand, yeah, okay, be true to yourself and admit it. But on the other hand, saying, oh, I'm just a bitch is just kind of an excuse to not be a decent person. And so I kind of feel like there's a lot of that going on.
One of the elders' repeated lines that actually he says not only to Fyodor, but also to Madame Khokhlakov, the woman of little faith, is above all, don't lie to yourself. That comes up in several different contexts. Did anyone else notice that that kind of contrast there between those different characters?
I like that actually.
Question, was it? We need an open-ended question. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting ways of thinking about the different characters, and this just sort of popped into my head while we were talking about this, but there's a line from some philosopher, maybe Merleau-Ponty, I don't remember, that every mask is a self-portrait, which I always love. And in this,
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Sure, sorry. It's that every mask is a self-portrait.
Oh, okay.
And in this case, as I sort of start going through the list of the characters, it's interesting to think about what it is that they are afraid of, that they are sort of projecting a self to cover up or to to compensate for, essentially. And you can think of it like for Ivan or Ivan, we kind of get Zosima kind of gets at that, where he says, like, you sort of pretend to be this detached intellectual, partly to cover up for this really deep-seated existential fear, like this really deep-seated pain that everything may be permitted, and that's not acceptable. Like that can't be how the world is. That there's you have this deep-seated sense that something's wrong, that you're sort of projecting this intellectual sense to compensate for. That Alexei, it's a Rakitin, right? Rakitin, like accuses him of like projecting this monkish, super decent self to compensate for basically being afraid of giving into his sensual base nature in the world. Musov seems like desperately afraid that everyone's going to realize that he's a fraud, and is sort of trying to protect himself against that. And Fyodor, if you like, can be you could pick. He is so concerned about how other people see him, and he is so concerned that nobody realize how much he cares what they think about him. It's that really, really, really self-conscious buffoonery, and so he suffers from an excess of self-awareness, not a deficit of it. Everyone is lying to themselves, I suppose, in at least this way, and lying really, really hard to the world.
Well, to kind of continue the list of characters you just went through and respond to your point, McGee, that's like Madame Kolokov too. She, like, I like that pairing because she is the only other one so far, I feel like, along with Fyodor, that like we've seen she's aware of how she's lying, right? Where she's like, look, some days I'm all ready to go off and be like, instead of trying to be a buffoon, she's like, I'm gonna go be this hero and I'm gonna minister to the poor, but she's able to say, but like, yeah, then I think about it and I realize in like 5 minutes I'd be pissed at the guy who's like not grateful that I'm binding his wounds. So that's really, I hadn't connected those two before, but we have two characters that are able to say at this point, like, dude, I'm totally doing this, it's such a put on, it's such an act. But from her we seem to see some genuine, like, I can't tell with her if she's genuinely trying to work through this or if it's all an act. Whereas with Fyodor, I think we see pretty clearly it's mostly an act. Like he has with the elder where he seems genuinely moved. To me, everything he says to the elder seems to be another game, but that might just be me. But that is a really interesting that she's like trying to pretend or project this image of being merciful and kind and good, which, like Alyosha, that can become its own kind of mask. But I like that idea. It's a self-portrait in some ways. It's who we want to be. Navigating who we want to be versus who we actually are and who we're pretending to be. Like, wow.
Quick point of clarification. If you're ever in doubt about any of the pronunciations for names, just ask. Ivan is actually the standard Russian pronunciation, so we can go with Ivan. I don't think there's any other real tricky ones in this section of the book. Does anyone have any others?
Since this is Murica, can I say Ivan?
You can, but we'll judge you just a little bit.
You can also say freedom fries.
Exactly. And if you don't like it, you can get out.
Okay, Florida.
Florida man deports entire rest of country.
Preemptive, we know what's coming.
I don't know if maybe I'm the only one, but I feel like maybe there's a sort of moment of genuineness with Fyodor when the elder, you know, kind of tells him what he's doing, and he's like, "You got me," you know. I don't think it lasts very long, but I thought maybe there was a hint of genuineness for a second, but it's hard to tell with him. It's definitely hard to tell for sure.
I sat and stared and I was confused whether he's just manipulating the situation or if he's having any kind of an insight. And it's like if you deal with narcissists or you deal with people who have these sorts of personalities, it's hard to tell when they're being genuine.
Okay, this is a weird parallel that I just thought of, but it reminded me of the scenes from The Dark Knight with the Batman and Joker, right? Where like the Batman is actually getting something about Joker, but then he'll immediately spin it again into that seems to be, I think you're right, McJay. I think there are moments of genuineness, but I think he immediately tries to cover them up or spin them or do something with them. Maybe because he is embarrassed, right? Like, I don't know. It's not a perfect parallel, but that was what I just thought of, so.
I think I'm seeing him with less empathy than some others of you.
Well, I think a lot of people do that. I mean, it's to different levels, but especially somebody who, like Fyodor, has built up this entire persona of being the buffoon. Anytime he would be genuine, I feel like he would immediately try and backpedal it. Like, that just makes perfect sense as to what he's doing. That's not to say he's not genuine, but yeah, that genuineness kind of brings out that feeling of shame again, brings out that, recognition, brings out that impulse to immediately play up the buffoon even more than he was before.
I think that's a pretty good insight. Like maybe he can be genuine, but then he's got to cover it up even more because then the cycle repeats, the shame. I'm also struck about Fyodor that he seems to be somehow familiar with the religious setting, with a lot of the kind of customs and of the monks. He's quoting scripture in certain passages. He's referring to lives of the saints, even ones that aren't authentic. But it's really kind of striking that kind of the crudest, biggest sensualist and man given over totally to his passions is the one that spends most of his time kind of sitting there pretending to be interested in all these religious questions, where you can see the rest of the people have no interest whatsoever who are gathered there.
Well, and he gave 1,000 rubles to the monastery, right? I have no idea how much that is, but the way they're talking about it, it seems like that was a big gift.
Yes. On that note, I actually spent some time this week looking up how much a ruble was worth back at that time because,
of course, you did.
Large quantities of rubles are going to be significant, very significant in the book, basically, what I found out is that's like a huge amount.
1,000.
Yeah. 3,000 rubles will be the significant sum in this book, and that's what I looked up specifically. And evidently, it's pretty hard to calculate the exact worth, but I found quote saying that was worth anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000.
Right.
Even if it's on the low end, like, someone could live comfortably on that amount for a very long time, like 10 years or something like that.
Usually, at least now, rubles are like 40 or 80 to $1.
Yeah, they were actually much closer to $1 back in those days, and that was during the gold standard. So anyway, when you're talking about hundreds or thousands of rubles, you're talking about years' wages, at least in the thousands. You're talking about years' wages. So significant a sum. I think it's somewhere it mentioned he was found to have possibly as much as 100,000 rubles. Fyodor is like a millionaire and beyond. So I just thought, with all the sort of talk of socialism and clearly the underlying tension about class that's part of this book, it'd be good to know these guys are like super rich. So I think this is also one of the sections of the book that starts to introduce some of the more serious topics. And it's maybe worth looking through a couple of those. Maybe we can just go kind of focusing by chapter. So we start to really delve into the question of faith and what is it based on, or miracles, what can you prove, etc. We've got this chapter, Women of Faith, followed by A Lady of Little Faith. What do you make of these two chapters and your first meeting with the elder and some of the discussions that come up about faith as you see it get kind of reflected and refracted off various pilgrims who are visiting the monastery?
The beauty of the elder with like the mother of the dead infant and the missing soldier and like the abused wife, and the discussion of active love that followed that with the gentry woman or whatever. There's a consistent theme in how he talked to everybody in terms of honesty and whatever active love is supposed to be.
Yeah, I think you've just underlined a really significant passage. I marked that passage in my book. I'll maybe see if I can find it, but other people can chime in.
I marked it as well. The active love was page 56 in my edition.
Yeah.
So he's talking to Madame Koklukov there. She's asking, how can it be proved? How, she's doubting about immortality or the existence of anything after death. She's an interesting character because a lot of times you hear other characters having these serious conversations about socialism and faith and like the new morals and all this sort of stuff. And she ends up being the one in whom she's almost like the punching bag for those ideas. Like they hit her and just get stuck. And you see that for the first time here. That'll happen again more, I think. She actually will return in the book. But
what do you mean by that? You mean like other characters can kind of talk about these ideas abstractly, but for her they become something she really has to wrestle with, and like, is that what you're saying? Like they're like, oh, let's toy with this idea of nothing's gonna happen after you die, and for her it's actually haunting her?
Yes, and often she'll be thinking about ideas that are really too big for her to understand, but you'll see that her brain trying to work through the same things the other characters are talking about. And so I think you can, in some ways, contrast her reaction to this question with whatever the internal question is in Yvonne that someone already referred to. The elder is like, you have this great, terrible, unresolved dilemma within you. Here she's working it out on a very like popular level. How can it be proved? And the elder says, well, one can't prove anything here, but it's possible to be convinced. And how? By the experience of active love. Try to love your neighbors actively and tirelessly. The more you succeed in loving, the more you'll be convinced of the existence of God and the immortality of your soul. And if you reach complete selflessness in the love of your neighbor, then undoubtedly you will believe, and no doubt will even be able to enter your soul. This has been tested. It is certain. And to me, I think there's some parallels in this chapter and in the whole presentation of the elder going out to meet the people that are supposed to be echoes of scenes from the Gospels. They talk about the crowds pressing up against him and people even wanting to try to touch, his garment and stuff like that. And I think this is kind of interesting that he gives this answer, and the immediate thing that Madame Koklakov says, active love. Well, that's another question, and talks about loving, I love mankind, but not. It's almost the same question as who is my neighbor in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Is that the one? I found it interesting that she kind of changes the subject, like, well, okay, I know I'm supposed to love, but but who? Because it's like, how in the world can you do that? And one of my favorite passages is when the elder talks about another, like a German doctor or someone who told him about how much he wanted to love mankind but was having trouble. And it says something like, here it is. Maybe I would really have gone to the cross for people if it were somehow suddenly necessary, and yet I'm incapable of living in the same room with anyone even for 2 days. This I know from experience. As soon as someone is there, close to me, his personality oppresses my self-esteem and restricts my freedom. In 24 hours, I can begin to hate even the best of men. One, because he takes too long eating his dinner. Another, because he has a cold and keeps blowing his nose.
Preach.
There's this quote from the Peanuts comic strip. And Linus says, I love humanity. It's people I can't stand.
Absolutely. I found it really personal to me when she was talking about how she can't love when people complain. Mm-hmm. When I've tried to do like philanthropic endeavors, like, and people who you're trying to help treat you badly, like how badly I internalize that. And I'm like, well, fuck this. I'm done helping people.
Well, and I think just this idea that so many of us, I feel like it's true that people would be willing to make these huge, sudden acts of sacrifice, but it turns out like the actual day-to-day loving of people is what's really hard, right? Like, and not to belittle big sacrifices, but that for many of us, it's, yeah. I think that that's in earnest in some ways to say that we would be willing to die for others in this sort of abstract way, but we cannot, we can't put up with someone being rude to us.
Yeah, try taking a road trip though.
Yes.
And what seems right there is that Father Zosima doesn't give her a way out, or doesn't tell her that it'll be easy, or they're if you follow this mantra or obey this wisdom, then that you can square that circle. What he says is, you're absolutely right. Loving people in the abstract is easy, and loving people in the concrete is really hard, and it takes your whole life. And maybe if you spend your whole life doing it, you will understand why you did it. And then forgive me for not being able to stay longer, but I am expected. Goodbye.
Oh, sorry. Oh, wait, you're not actually leaving. You're quoting Joe.
Oh, no. Sorry, that's in the.
That's a quote.
Oh, okay. I was like, Jason, don't go.
Forgive me.
He's expected.
That is how I'm signing off from now on.
I also can't help but draw the parallel or the contrast here of all this section with the character of Miasov, who I think is the exact embodiment in this chapter of not being able to put up with people, right? And being a man of like the noblest ideals and the progressive generation, and being so concerned to change society for the better, but he just can't stand to be in the same room, especially with Fyodor. But you can tell like he's got to go. One of the parts that I found really funny was he's trying to tell some story about a quote he heard where a guy basically said, you know, we keep an eye on the socialists, but the Christian socialists are the really scary ones. But it takes him like 2 paragraphs of explaining like how he met this guy, what his position was, why the guy listened to him, and how, given his, you know, how Miasov had been received by his superior and blah, blah, blah. It's a whole bunch of like posturing, like why this guy was willing to give me the inner scoop, you know. I find Miasov to be an absolutely hilarious character, and I think an intentional sort of caricature of you know, some of the revolutionaries that Dostoevsky wasn't that fond of. I hope you all enjoyed Miasov. I just love him arguing with and getting upset.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of drove me crazy. He's so concerned with appearances, and it makes him so uptight, and it makes him explode, which makes him even more concerned that now he just exploded, and he just like, I felt terrible for him because he just ramped everything up to this crazy level.
He took it to 11.
Well, he's like gunpowder for Fyodor. It's just, you know, he's ready to go off.
Or vice versa. Yeah.
I was gonna say, sometimes I feel like this is revealing
They
too
play
much
off
about
each other.
this is revealing too much about me, but like I see parts of myself in Fyodor, and I definitely see parts of myself in Miasov, who, like, I feel like it's really fascinating that we see his thought process, which I don't know about y'all, but I've definitely been through this where you're like, no, I'm not going to engage. I know this person's going to drive me crazy. It's going to be fine. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And then 5 minutes later, you're like, are you kidding me? I just can't. I can't keep my mouth shut anymore. And then you're like, damn it, I did it again. And you're like, no, this time I'm going to be nice. And then you do it. You're like, oh, and you say these gracious things. And you're like, yeah, I was so super gracious. That was awesome. And then they like push your buttons one more time. And then you're just like, I don't know. I definitely see that in myself.
I just cannot. I simply cannot, and I won't.
That's never happened at any of our family get-togethers ever in my whole life. Never. So I'll say it. Like, it's weird because we're talking about these characters, but I also see parts of so many of them in me, and that's one of the things I find so fascinating in this book. I think I said this in one of our other chats, where like, or maybe I was just saying this to you, McG, where like in this age of BuzzFeed quizzes, you know, and it's like, which Karamazov are you? And I'm like, I'm every character in this book, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah,
earlier, somebody was talking about, I think it was Jason was talking about masks and self-portraits, and I didn't jump in at the time because it only seemed tangentially related, and then we went somewhere else. But it kind of made me think a little bit of the phenomenon where the things that annoy you most about other people are things you hate about yourself. And I think between Miasov and Fyodor, there's a little bit of that going on. I think Miasov is so terrified of ever seeming like a buffoon that he just can't even.
Simply cannot. I love that. The modern translation would say he just can't even. Perfect.
I was going to say it a little more eloquently, but
it's almost word for word though with what he actually says. That's what's so funny. Yeah, I think it's even possible to see all these characters in the whole book as some sort of confession of you know, the embarrassing insides of humanity, you know. And I don't know that we're supposed to necessarily side with one or the other in this occasion, or be like, you know, Miasov, what an idiot, you know, and just it's almost like we're being Miasov by doing that, you know. And you certainly have a contrast in the elder, who is trying to be patient and really gentle with everybody. Like he's somehow able to put up with these guys, even though it's really using up energy, but it's like, you know, he's able to be with them even in the total clownishness, you know. And he gives gentle rebukes, like, you know, you're lying again.
Well, and I thought it was an interesting contrast, his responses versus later when things totally blow up in the dinner with the Father Superior. And there, the Father Superior and the monks are trying, like, they keep quoting these scriptures, right? Like, well, it is said that if you are offended, you should, like, somehow they come off very stilted to me. Like, they're definitely saying the right Christian pietistic things, like, I will not be offended by this, and here is the Bible verse about why I'm not offended. Whereas I feel like Zosima often really, like, he's almost like, okay, I'm gonna go now, don't lie. Try, you know what I mean? There's something, like, joking and gentle about him. I don't know if anyone else noticed that, but
well, yeah, I mean his whole personality and whole, I mean, I think it's really a gift. I think that's what makes him such a great spiritual leader, and the reason he's the elder who is revered and looked to is because he does have that gift of being patient with people, being gentle with people, noticing things about people, but not being all judgy about it. It's really easy to see why he's so revered, I think.
I want to draw attention to one other scene with the elder in going out to meet the people, which Aaron already referred to, and then we'll maybe move on to other characters. But I thought it was worth highlighting this one scene, which Aaron referred to, where he comforts, he speaks with the mother who's lost a child. I don't know if you guys are reading the footnotes, but in case you didn't, the child died at the exact same age that Dostoevsky's own son died. His own son happened to be named Alexei, right? Which is, you know, I just thought that was worth pointing out. Definitely wrestling with how do we respond to suffering, kind of pointless, irrational, insane, unjust, evil, and suffering in the world is a major question in this book, and this is the first time it comes up in a big way. Is here's a woman who has lost all her children, including the last one at this very young age of 3, and I'm curious to hear how you guys think he handled that.
As beautifully as someone possibly can. I think there'd be a lot of gnashing of teeth at that, and I know a lot of people who wouldn't be comforted that there's a metaphysical explanation, but they're there. He's an elder, and given the framework they're operating in, I think he was perfect. I felt touched by it.
It's touching in the metaphysical way. He also, again, a little bit like the refusing to give an easy path for how to serve individual humans rather than imagining serving mankind. He again says, like, it's just going to take a long time, and you're going to be very, very sad, and eventually you will feel a little bit better. There are. It's interesting that he provides no easy answers to the kind of metaphysical questions that people put to him in this way, or I guess emotional questions, because it almost overlaps a little bit with, it's an open question whether he's actually physically healing people. Where Lisa, is it right? The question, they're like, "You've healed her," and he's like, "She's not walking." He's like, but she's a little better. And again, it's an open question whether he's doing something. He's refusing to do anything magical to heal people's emotions, and he's saying maybe there is no magical answer. It's going to be hard.
Do you think that's humility or skepticism on his part?
On his part, I think. Oof.
Are you talking about in the question of the miracle?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, because I was struck by that as well when they said Lisa or whatever is like doing better. He's like, maybe, like, could be a lot of stuff.
And there's more, yeah. And so like for him, it's presumably humility. I don't think he thinks he's doing magic, although it's hard to know. Then there's a question of what the narrator thinks about it, and then what Dostoevsky thinks about it, and I don't know the answers to those questions.
Just to answer that one personally, Aaron, I don't think he wants to agree very quickly with Madame Koklikov, who is mentioned with some phrase of being a very sentimental person. So I read it as some skepticism on his part or some hesitation to say, yes, this is a miracle, like definitely, maybe, wait and see. And if it happened, it's not because of me, right? So both, I think, is the answer there.
This is like a pro athlete's press conference after the game. You thank your teammates. You say, I don't know, and then you just get out of the way.
Even in the case of a real miracle, he'd probably say the same thing. I am glad. I was hoping someone would draw out that point about how even in his reassurance, he really doesn't give an easy answer. I actually don't like the first part of his answer when he says, "Oh, it's an angel in heaven now." I hate that sort of stuff. I think he did that sort of answer more gently and more maybe believably than other people do. But I was really glad that he got to that second part, like where he says, "You know what? And you should weep." Like this is Rachel weeping because her children are gone. Like, don't try to ignore the evil and injustice that you've lost a person. Like this is going to scar you for life, and you'll weep, but eventually it will get softer, and also it might be changing you in a way that does help, that does produce something, good or beautiful or some sort of growth, which maybe is a bit of a Russian idea. Like you'll suffer and it'll be good for you.
Yeah, I have to say I did not like his answer to, again, like you, the first part of the answer about how, oh, he's an angel, it's fine. I was like, that's not comforting.
Right.
At all. I mean, maybe it is a little bit to some people, but in general, I hate that sort of answer. But yeah, the part about, yeah, you're going to cry your eyes out, but eventually you'll get a little bit better. I think that's, I don't know, more along the lines of a helpful answer.
And I think, interestingly, too, he comforted her a little bit in the moment, and he also managed to send her, to maybe get her back in a place where she can deal with her grief better. Like, well, go back to your family, go back to your home. Like, don't just run away and kind of be despairing about life, but like try to go on with the people who also understand what, he kind of achieved a good effect there without really forcing or pushing or compelling. He created this natural desire for her to be back, right?
Yeah, and I think as like a modern feminist, I don't know, that's such a generalization, but I think it struck me a little bit weird, go back to your husband, go back to your husband, go back to your husband. But then when I looked at it again, what he's really saying is go on with your life.
Right.
And I think that's a positive.
Yeah, or like there are other people that are going to need you.
Yeah.
Still, you still have some things to do in this life. Like, don't give up and just wander around aimlessly,
I liked that he kind of made the cast the grief as a healthy, normal process. And I mean, he even cast it as like metaphysical work that was in its own way glorifying God, which was maybe a stretch to me, but casting it as like a normal, healthy process, like this is something that you should do when you lose a child, especially your last child after you've lost your others. Like this is a normal process. Don't run away from it. Engage in it and live through it and work through it. But it's a normal, healthy process. That was the part of the answer that I thought was kind of the crux of it, the important piece of it.
I don't know anything about this, but it would be really interesting to find out if biographically, you know, he had written or reflected anything on the loss of his own child, Dostoevsky. And it'd be interesting to try to ask, would he himself be comforted by the elder's answer? Does he agree? Would he align his views with the others? I don't know, but I'm real curious to know, because clearly it's a question that came up from his own life. So it's interesting to find it in this chapter.
Well, and I haven't read anything about like if he wrote, but I do know, as I said, I think in one of our previous talks, he ended up at the Optina monastery after his son died. So he did go and spend a significant chunk of time at a monastery with elders after his son's own death. So what he made of it, I don't know, but that is at least a partial answer to some of your question, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Does anyone else kind of see it weird that this lady like lost two or three other children that she didn't feel all that sorry for, but then like finally the last one, like
Yes, that was so weird.
She murdered the first two, obviously.
My first thought was that was weird, but then I remembered she's a peasant, right? Like I was having this memory of being in history classes and hearing about how often American farming families lost children, right? That you had 15 kids because 7 of them are going to die before they hit 10 years old. So like I thought it was weird that she didn't have an emotional reaction, but then I was kind of thinking like, well, this I think was sort of responding to some of what we were saying last week. Like, does Dostoevsky have this really negative view of the peasants? And that to me felt like this really sad, compassionate picture of like, you've lived such a hardened life that your kids keep dying and you're just accustomed to it. But then at a certain point, it breaks you. That's my...
Yeah, and there was a whole section of exposition by the narrator talking about there's like a silent suffering among the people that's of this sort, and then there's this other kind that's like the chafing within and all that. And I do think it's somewhat pointing to just the how tough life is for the average Russian at this time. And maybe maybe for this lady, I mean, psychologically, partly what's happening is all the weight of everything is hitting her with the last child, and it's been put off, and you know, because of necessity from hard life. Now it's like I just you know can't avoid it anymore or whatever. But yeah, I was also struck by that line when she confesses, well, the first 3 is kind of like, I wasn't that sorry, but this one,
and you know,
this is a good kid.
I don't know exactly how she says it, but there's also a way. I guess it just says I wasn't too sorry about them. But there's also a way to interpret that, you know, going along with what Melissa pointed out about child deaths being so much more common then. Of saying, instead of saying I wasn't sorry about it, maybe I grieved a normal amount and moved on. And then this time I couldn't move on and I left my home and I've been wandering around. I mean, that's just a different level. It doesn't mean she didn't grieve for her other children necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think all of your 14 children dying was always sad. I think we just
when the 15th
I've heard down the age, it's totally anecdotal, but from relatives that was just horrible, and it was endlessly horrible every time, even if they had a bunch of them.
I wonder if it's like more of a deeper meaning here, actually. Like the woman like was, either running away or just wasn't in the capacity to grieve, and now all of a sudden she's got this capacity, and like the elders like telling her like you need to use that, like this is developmental for you almost. Like she can all of a sudden see the humanity, and it's like the things that are left behind like trigger like some sort of attachment, and like for whatever reason she didn't have that attachment for the other children.
An empty house can get really loud.
Yeah, but I don't know. It's like it's I kind of see it as like this lady's like coming, and this is like a spiritual journey for her almost, where she sees like the child for a real person, and like the other ones were kind of not persons or something, like not worthy of grief, or she's not capable of grieving, and then like all of a sudden her heart's opened or something. I don't know. That's how I kind of would like to take it.
I think there's a lot of great like possible insights from all these different perspectives. I've enjoyed hearing all those. I was real curious to hear how people reacted to that. So thank you for that. I want to move on now. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about all these different anecdotes with the elder because they're intriguing and somewhat mysterious. I want to move on though to this mysterious "So Be It" chapter.
Yes.
So be it.
And I'd like to ask specifically people who are reading this for the first time, who don't know anything else about Ivan and his trajectory, what in the world do you make of this chapter? And, shoot away. This, by the way, if you don't remember that by name, this is the one where
Pure ultramontanism.
About church and state.
Right. They get into this discussion about the weird article that he's written. About ecclesiastical courts and their place. So,
well, what struck me wasn't so much what Ivan wrote, I don't think. Okay, I gotta be honest. I was reading this afternoon because I put off my reading until today because I just did. Because I'm a procrastinator. And then I was like so sleepy. I was trying to take a nap and read this chapter and be confused all at the same time. But I think it was actually not so much what Ivan wrote, but what the elder goes on, Zosima goes on for like 3 pages about church and state and about how the church should be the entire state, not just part of it, and how they shouldn't be separated at all. And I feel like I need to read that about 5 more times to process it.
There was a line that I was rereading it, but there was one where one of them said, that it was the opposite of what he thought it was, that it was, it's not the church that turns into the state, you see, that is Rome in its dream. That's the third temptation of the devil. On the contrary, the state turns into the church. It rises up to the church, becomes the church over all the earth. It's the complete opposite. Yeah, that's what I was.
This gets very confusing because you've got 3 or 4 different speakers representing different viewpoints with similar phrases, and I think it's a little bit difficult for us to understand the actual question that they're dealing with to begin with. But so Ivan's article gets summarized in one particular spot briefly as saying the church must become the state. So that's Ivan's position. And then you have some back and forth about that. I think the elder talks about how the church could never take over criminal judgments because it's the only place that isn't condemning people, and the sinner needs somewhere to go. So there's some of that, but I won't speak too much. I want to hear from other people who read this for the first time.
I think the hardest thing for me is, like, personally, I'm 21st century agnostic, totally anti-capitalist, like all these like my own personal feelings, like way liberal, progressive, all this stuff where I'm coming from, and I'm reading this and I'm thinking that the whole idea about the church becoming the state actually doesn't sound like a terrible idea. It's very confusing.
I did not see that coming.
Right. And I'm like, that sort of goes against everything I think, except it's presented in a completely different context.
Well, and the big question is, why would Yvonne, the atheist, as it's kind of admitted at some point in book 2, why in the world is he writing this? That's the question. Like, does he believe it? What does that mean? What is he saying? I don't know.
Puzzles are fun. I see a lot of myself in that, in that puzzles can be fun. And sometimes it's fun to play with philosophical arguments and word games, and it's also fun to troll people too.
Yeah, I think he's doing in the intellectual sphere what his dad does in a face-to-face conversation. Like, he just walks in and he bullshits people, and that's his way of I don't know, drawing attention to himself and making other people uncomfortable and just controlling the conversation in a way.
You know, sometimes academics, either, you know, depending on if they're consulting or if they're trying to find, you know, a hole in the literature to publish in, sometimes things get written.
Well, it's always interesting to play devil's advocate and to argue for positions that you don't necessarily believe in, just to see where the argument goes.
Yep, that was my first point.
It's a bit of an enigma. I'll invite those who were silenced by not having read this for the first time if they want to say something without giving too much away. I think that might just be Melissa. So.
Well, can I just ask a question? Because I'm afraid if I say anything, I'll give too much away.
Yeah.
Well, then, like, what do people make of Father Zosima, whose take on this is like, okay, Yvonne, maybe you're trolling, maybe you're just an academic playing with ideas, but I think there's some deep conflict in you that this is about, right? Like, I don't know his exact words. I don't have the page in front of me, but so far, it's like, for the most part, we've bought Zosima's read of Fyodor. We've kind of bought his responses to the grieving women in various ways. So, like, it seems like, okay, so maybe he's onto something, but then, like, what's Yvonne's deep conflict? I mean, especially since we have a bunch of intellectuals hanging out here who may or may not at various times have wanted to troll people or write shit just to write shit. Like, what might be the deep conflict underneath all that?
I was going to ask that exact question, and
it's like we're married.
The scene you just sort of referenced, where Zosima gives his read of Yvonne, is on page 70, about halfway down. And this follows page 69. Miasov decides he's going to unmask Yvonne. And he's like, okay, this guy's pretending like he's, you know, writing on the issue as a churchman or whatever. But let me tell you about a conversation he had over dinner last night with a few ladies that I overheard, where he basically said, you know, there's no law of nature that man should love mankind. And if you don't believe in immortality, everything's permissible. And it's almost...
including eating each other.
Yes, did anybody else have to Google the meaning of that word?
Anthropophagy?
Yeah, it's basically cannibalism.
Right. And he ended with the assertion that for every separate person, like ourselves, for instance, who believes neither in God nor in his own immortality, the moral law of nature ought to change immediately into the exact opposite of the former religious law, and that egoism even to the point of evil doing, should not only be permitted, but should be acknowledged as the necessary, the most reasonable, and all but the noblest result of his situation. From this paradox, gentlemen, you may deduce what our dear eccentric and paradoxalist Ivan Fyodorovich may be pleased to proclaim. So I think we have to contrast his church ecclesiastical court article with this conversation and then answer Melissa's question.
Right.
When the elder writes, "You weren't quite joking, that's true," and continues on, I highlighted that and wrote my struggle. I see a lot of that in myself. That's and I think that it's a conflict between rationalism and being of this world and wanting to believe in something beyond that. For at least it is for me. And I suck at the believing part, but I really want to, and it causes a lot of conflict.
For the record, now I can see myself in almost every character, but the first time I read this book, I was pretty sure I was Yvonne. So I hear ya.
I just, at the part where he, sorry, words.
Words are hard. Well,
I don't know how to use them. Where they were saying about, if you don't believe in anything, then cannibalism is okay. All I wanted to do was scream at them and quote Anne from The Sparrow. When, I don't know how many people senior year of college read The Sparrow with me, but she goes on this whole rant about, because she's atheist or at least agnostic, and her priest best friend is saying, but you still do good things. And she goes on this whole thing and says, well, I don't require belief in a heavenly power or the threat of hell for me to just want to be a good person. I want to be a good person because I know it's good. And I want to be a good, I don't need religion in order to be good. And she says it much more eloquently than that.
I was hoping someone would respond to Yvonne's argument here. This is a fairly important argument in this book. So I'm curious to hear other people's take on that, and before we get to Melissa's question fully.
I think Jenny just did, saying that there is a good regardless of what exists or does not exist aside from what's seen. That's what you were just saying, Jenny?
Yes.
Or at least according to Sparrow or whatever.
Well, I happen to agree with Anne in this case, yeah. I think you can be a good person without belief in God.
But I think Yvonne's argument is a little different from that here. I read this book a very long time ago, so I know some of the broad strokes of what's coming and in terms of how Yvonne's argument gets developed and what happens to him, but not a lot of the specifics, so I'm mostly coming in blind here. But Yvonne reads a little bit, or at the very least, Miusov's version of Yvonne's argument reads a little bit like a jerk who just read Richard Dawkins or evolutionary psychology for the first time. And Yvonne's argument is not just that if there's no immortality, you can do whatever you want. It's if there's immortality, you should do whatever you want. You have to. If morality or if the way that we think about things has been built on natural law, then if it turns out that natural law is not love of your neighbor, but natural law is egoism, then we must behave egoistically. That is how we ought to be behaving. But I think that Ginny's answer is actually still pretty strong here. I don't think Zosima responds. I don't remember exactly whether Zosima responds exactly immediately, but his response to the gentry woman kind of applies here. He said, the response about active love is almost it would almost qualify as a response to Yvonne's thing, to Yvonne's existential torment, which is to say, you can't think yourself there. You just kind of have to live it in terms of active love, and then eventually you will understand what has been going on. Ugh.
Well said. I made a note in the margin on my copy of the book here where I highlighted this whole conversation as reported by Miasov, and in the column I wrote Satanism. If you're at all familiar with Satanism as an actual movement or philosophy or religion or whatever, this is exactly what it teaches is, you know, there is no God, therefore do whatever you want. And if you're like one of the people, you know, smart enough to understand the situation, then you'll think for yourself and, you know, decide whatever you want to do, and no one should try to stop you, or they're, you know, just like limiting your self-expression or whatever. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting, like, this is an actual movement in thought, but it's Satanism.
Well, like, I liked the Dawkins parallel. For me, and I'll be honest, philosophers caveat here, like, I have never had much time or patience for Nietzsche, but when I started in grad school, there were a lot of dudes, and it was always dudes that had read a bunch of Nietzsche, and this was like talking to them, right? Like, why shouldn't we just like do whatever we want and be super powerful all the time? And so, but I mean, I say that jokingly, but I am one of the people who kind of thinks Yvonne has a point, not because I think you have to have religion to be a good person, but because of like the way you were saying it, Jason, like, well, if like the natural order, if the natural law of things is just killing the crap out of each other all the time, why shouldn't we, right? Like, what is this idea to be good? I think that like leads into some of like, you know, the Marxist ideas about like religion just being an opiate for the masses. Like, why shouldn't we all just rise up and take what's ours and do what's right for us? I think to me, it's a real question that kind of gets posed here, and that's really interesting. I was going to say something else too.
I like how I can hear hinges of like poorly constructed libertarianism and socialism in all of these comments, like the ways you could read this in terms of like opiate to the masses. What do you do? Egoists, take for yourself. What do we do? Share it all. Why would you share it all if it's all egoistic? How does that translate into socialism? You should, you know, continue to take and take and take.
Right. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Is I felt like I should especially mention this because we were initially doing this in honor of Chris. This was a really interesting conversation I had with Chris one night out on the McGarvey's porch. Was he had such a long interest in evolutionary biology and the history, and like how you could reconcile that with with the church in the 19th century. And I felt like, I mean, that's going in all sorts of directions that kind of aren't here, but kind of are, because Yvonne is this intellectual that's drinking from all of these fountains, right? Is like, look, if it's natural law, if we're all just duking it out, like, if there's no higher good, why shouldn't we all just get what's ours and, like, you know, nature red in tooth and claw, rock on, man, take it to 11, just to bring it back to our theme for the night.
I mean, religion helps a lot of people not think of the world as a zero-sum game.
Right.
Well, and the other thing, like, okay, you keep saying natural law, and that's what they call it in the book, but yes, there's a level, and of course, I don't know that much about the animal kingdom. I'm realizing as I'm about to make this argument that I might be totally wrong, but there's definitely this sense where, that's hilarious, Dinah just jumped up for this part of the conversation.
Yes, our expert on natural law.
So there's definitely this kind of like survival of the fittest, you know, tooth and claw, animal kingdom, whatever, but like elephants grieve. Animals adopt animals of other species to mother them. I mean, natural law involves a lot of love and a lot of emotion and a lot of things that we tend to think of as being uniquely human are also found in animals. So this whole idea of animal law being egoism, kill or be killed, I don't buy.
Fair. I think I was reflecting the very social Darwinian 19th century ideas that I think were like percolating in, but I love the points you just made.
Well, I'd like to make a counterpoint with and I get to use the word anthropophagy for it, is also that chimpanzees make war and they eat their own species when they kill them you know. So I don't know, like there's definitely multiple strains going on in the world of nature, but I do think he has a point that there is no necessary or definite law of nature that man should love mankind. I don't know. I give him some ground on that. I think he has somewhat of a point.
So to follow up, I'll read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Diller and get to talk about whether nature is morally good or not. Yes.
Hooray.
I want to slightly shift the focus here now to the follow-up of that conversation. Melissa's original question, you know, kind of what do you make of the elders' read of Yvonne? Do you want to restate your question?
I think you just did.
Okay. I want to point out on the next page on 70, you know, he says, yes, that's my contention. There is no virtue if there is no immortality. And then a monk responds, you are blessed if you believe so, or else most unhappy. And then we get that, I guess that's probably the elder there. Yeah. Then we get this response about, you weren't quite joking, that's true. This idea is not yet resolved in your heart and torments it. But a martyr too sometimes likes to toy with his despair, also from despair as it were. For the time being, you too are toying out of despair with your magazine articles and drawing room discussions, without believing in your own dialectics and smirking at them with your heart aching inside you. The question is not resolved in you, and there lies your great grief, for it urgently demands resolution. And then he says, but there gets to be this really sudden, earnest, serious moment between the two. And Yvonne says, but can it be resolved myself, resolved in a positive way? In other words, this is very much reflecting that Madame Koklikov, can I know for sure? Can it be proved that there's immortality? And the elder says, even if it cannot be resolved in a positive way, it will never be resolved in the negative way either. You yourself know this property of your heart, and therein lies the whole of its torment. But thank the Creator that he has given you a lofty heart, capable of being tormented by such a torment, to set your mind on things that are above, for our true homeland is heaven. May God grant that your heart's decision overtake you still on earth, and may God bless your path. The elder raised his hand and was about to give his blessing to Yvonne from where he sat, but the latter suddenly rose from his chair, went over to him, received his blessing, and having kissed his hand, returned silently to his place. He looked firm and serious. This action, as well as the whole preceding conversation with the elder, so unexpected from Yvonne, somehow struck everyone with its mysteriousness and even a certain solemnity, so that for a moment they all fell silent. And Alyosha looked almost frightened. What happened there? The book went out of its way to explain how everybody who came into the room with the elder basically disrespected him right at the beginning by not observing the proper customs and receiving the blessing. And Yvonne was one of them. And now he suddenly receives the blessing. So there's the question. Is the elder reading him right? What's happening with Yvonne in this moment? And I might also invite, like, Rakitin has a read on Yvonne that we can talk about later too.
I mean, one of the things that's compelling about what Yvonne, or I think the elder is recognizing in both of Yvonne's arguments, both about the church and about morality, is the idea of, living your convictions. Essentially, it is sort of that if you take the church's doctrines seriously, then there is no compatibility between the church and a secular state. Or if you take, the idea that natural law is, or that there's no such thing as immortality seriously, there is, follow that to its logical endpoint, and there is no natural law altogether. And so what the elder maybe seems to be recognizing and honoring in him in that moment is his seriousness, that he takes these questions with the weight that they deserve, and Yvonne is gratified by being seen in that way. That was my read on that moment.
I think my take on it is that Ivan is agnostic rather than atheist, which, again, being a label I strongly apply to myself. You know, approaching things from such an intellectual viewpoint as he does, but not ruling out, not saying, you know, oh, absolutely, I know there's definitely not a God, but just there's all these questions, and like you say, following things to their logical conclusions. If I follow things to their logical conclusions, they sort of stop making sense, and life is sort of all about contradictions. And as far as his reaction to Zosima, I think he like you said, Jason, he feels seen, he feels heard, he feels understood. He wants to show back that respect, you know, and not disrespect him, even if he doesn't believe 100% the same things. He feels very moved and connected in that moment.
I'm agreeing with a lot of what everyone's saying, and I'm trying to be very careful now to make sure I'm not saying anything that sort of, because I know what's going to happen to so many of the characters. But I just think I've always felt a lot, like I said, I've seen a lot of myself in Yvonne. I keep thinking of, there was this quote, we first read this book out at the Oregon Extension when we were students, and we read this other this theology book by James Allison, who said one of his first lines in the book is like, theology is for those of us who are doomed to drag our intellects with us through our whole life, right? Like some people just believe, and then some of us are chained to our intellect, and that like always resonated with me. And that's kind of how I see Yvonne, is like he's this person that's really chained to his intellect. Like he can't escape some of these questions. And I feel like there's a part of him that kind of wants to, and that Zosima's recognizing, like I think with so many of the characters, he's seeing behind the facade that there is some real big question in Yvonne's heart, but that he's masked it. And he's done so in this very brilliant way that most people like can't even keep up with. So they're just sort of dazzled by it. And to have someone pierce through that and see through it, I think really touches him. And I think he's moved by that. And I just find it striking because, like we said, like Fyodor kind of is like, every time Zosima sees through his mask, he has to like spin things up again. Like, no, don't let the circus stop. Got to keep the distractions up. And even I feel like Madame Kolokov does that to a way, right? Like, oh, like she has to be like more dramatic. And I feel like he has this, like, to me, that moment is one of the most striking in the chapters. He just kind of quietly like takes that recognition of himself. I don't know. There, I've run out of things to say. Next.
I feel like Yvonne just wants to know everything, and Zosima is like, you can't know everything. You can't know everything positively. You can't know everything negatively. And like you were saying, he just likes to talk. He likes to talk circles around everyone else. He's an intellectual. He can keep everyone on their feet and lose them, and they can't really provide any sort of like cogent answers to what he's trying to solve, because it's just internally spinning it. And this answer comes out of left field. Like, you won't have an answer, and like, it's good that you can struggle with this, and like, but you're never going to get an answer. And like, that's living in life in the middle is where you're going to be. Like, it's just going to be how it is. I feel like that's a lot of things with a lot of questions that we have. Like, we're so like, I don't know, just science and everything else, like modern life, like we want to have all these answers, but they're really, for a lot of things, there's not a lot of real answers, and like we're not very capable with addressing that. Like, we want to latch on, and by doing so, we like limit our minds and our thoughts to specific like arguments, and we don't actually address that. It's unaddressable, and we'll really never actually be able to understand it completely. And we're like, I don't know, in this day and age, it seems like, and it seems also in previous days and ages, that that's a very difficult situation to be in.
Isn't it very intriguing when you put it that way, that the elder Zosima seems to be the only one that's comfortable standing in that middle position of uncertainty? and says, this is the place you should be. It's good for you.
Yeah. I also think it's really interesting, though, that he takes Ivan seriously. Like, he's neither intimidated by him, nor does he fully dismiss him, right? Like, I think he sees a difference between Yusuf, who just seems to want to perform some sort of intellectual rigor, and he sees Ivan as a real question. And this is where I'm interested to know if other people saw that, or if that's just kind of me projecting, because I do feel like that, again, this is my very personal, I feel like I'm often in this weird spot of like, hey, I am the intellectual person that now kind of lives in the Orthodox world, and I've moved, like, but I remember how, well, McGee, like, one of the only people I've met in the Orthodox Church that I immediately was like, oh my gosh, this person has clearly been touched by God. They have some kind of holiness. They were also one of the first people that took my intellectualism and my political questions and all that very seriously, right? They didn't have this need to like quickly answer it for you. So it's like living in the middle ground, but I also feel like that's meeting people where they are, that they were just like, that's a question you have. That shows your good heart, right? Like there's a way of understanding that people come into this world from all different places. I don't know. I really saw some of that but I feel like this is an interesting point of tension, and I don't know where you stand on this reading, McGee, but I feel like in the past, I like gave Ivan so much more room, like thought his heart was much better than you did. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like we've had that fight in the past. Not fight, that's too strong a word. That critical dispute in the past. Well, no, because I think it's fair. He wasn't it was fun because we read this while I was teaching it back at the OE, and some students were really hard on Ivan and some really love him. And I'm someone who's always sort of thought he has a really good heart, but then he has weird moments where he shuts down, where he we could talk then about when he shoves poor Maximov out of the carriage a little bit later because he's pissed off. Like, what?
Weird.
So someone had brought up Nietzsche. And when I was reading this, I had thought that Ivan was like Nietzsche talking to Camus with the elder, because the elder is talking about how things are unknowable and maybe existence is absurd, and he's doing this in a very gentle and polite and occasionally mystical way, but is saying essentially what Taggy said, is that some things are unknowable, and that doesn't mean you're not going to stop pursuing it, and I think that what he's saying is not just to accept that, but to continue the pursuit of the question, even if it's unknowable. That he met him where he is, that he wants to have these discussions, that he wants to, whatever he called them, his drawing room discussions or whatever. that he didn't try and shut those down. I have a similar thing with Melissa in that I'm Episcopalian, but also, a PhD, and that's the only faith community where they've been like, yeah, that's good. Keep asking. Don't stop asking these questions that we can't answer.
And I think that's part of what makes me respect Zosimus so much as a holy man, and in general, like your and Melissa's examples just now of people who are deeply, deeply religious, but don't think that they have all the answers. And I think where religion runs into so many problems and conflicts is when holy people or religious people or whatever think that they know everything because they're religious. Like, oh, let me just quote the Bible at you, or let me just quote such and such at you and have this pat answer, and that's the way it is because God said so. The end, don't argue. I think there's something so limiting in that makes a lot of people, it causes a lot of conflict, I guess.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. I mean, we grew up in America. I grew up in central Illinois, where there's a lot of Protestants, and they don't think of it as a mystery. They think of it as knowledge, and that drove me away from faith for many, many, many years until I ran into the more Catholic types of faiths that are like mystery. You don't know. But I was agreeing with you, Jenny, in that a lot of the types that we deal with, the Protestant, the Pentecostal type, they have an answer.
Totally. My experience with fundamentalism pretty much drove me away from the church. which is sad because I grew up in a very liberal Lutheran family.
Somehow altogether more enlightened, which is to say, more Lutheran. That's a quote from Fyodor in the first book.
Yes, there's a couple times he mentions something about Lutherans, and I was like, that's a weird thing to say, but I don't remember exactly what it was.
Well, he's viewing them as more enlightened European continental, sensible types as compared to the, Russian. There's a lot of times in this book where they're making fun of Russia or complaining about Russia and its kind of backwoods, hillbilly nature or whatever. So.
Well, I mean, Martin Luther was like the ultimate intellectual. Like his whole 95 Theses, he wasn't trying to break away from the church. He was trying to start an academic discussion. True story.
We have many former Lutherans among us here. I just want to.
Strange that they're all former Lutherans. But...
we have one current Lutheran in the group too. That's Pastor Chris Brademeyer, but he's not been able to make it this week. So I just wanted to respond to Melissa's point about Yvonne and our past disputes. And I would say my position may have evolved over the years, but I don't know if we can really talk about that in depth at this point in the book. I do think it's really tough to make a call on Yvonne's heart because he keeps his cards really close. So he's kind of a mystery, and I think we'll enjoy having more conversations about him as we learn more. I would like to move forward now. I think we've paid Yvonne plenty of time for this book.
I do think it's mean that he pushed Maximov out of the carriage. I'm just saying. It's really mean.
I think that's hilarious. I love the whole Maximov thing. Like this giant scandal has just happened, and everyone's
coming with you.
And like Fyodor's been making fun of him the whole time, saying, "You look like this guy that got murdered in this crazy way, man." Like, and then, "Oh, come along, Bunsan. Come on, we'll have some fun." And he's like, the picture of him running and jumping into the moving carriage and then getting dumped out the Yvonne is like one of the funniest parts of the book. I want to move on to another somewhat enigmatic chapter, the seminarist careerist. And here we have Rakitin and Alyosha in the spotlight for the first time. And I had to skim through this section. I didn't get to read it all in depth on my today. So it's been like a month or so since I've read it. So I'm going to just ask open-ended questions here. What do we learn in this chapter about Alyosha? What do we learn about Rakitin? And Rakitin gives his read on the whole situation. What do you think of Rakitin's read of the Karamazovs?
Contempt?
Yeah. You wonder whether it says more about Rakitin than it does about the Karamazovs, in terms of his cynicism, and his accusations of sensual, like everything has just a base and sensual purpose. It's the footnotes give away that Rakitin is going to be revealed as a Western fetishist or whatever, and so that colors the reading a little bit. But he's a cynic, and he has some insight into these humans, but I think that it's filtered through his very, very, very particular gaze.
I haven't read this yet, so I don't know that if this is accurate or giving anything away. But I picture him like in the background doing this. Like it seems like he's scheming or plotting or like making a a sequential move to strategically do something. I don't know what yet, but he seems like he's manipulating as well as being cynical. I agree with Jason about that. You agree, Buzzy Bear? Buzzy Bear agrees.
Melissa stepped out for a second. I'm waiting to hear if she wants to chime in on this one. I have some things to say, but I don't want to. Melissa, are you there?
Yeah. Yep.
Do you have anything to that you wanted to say about Rakitin and Alyosha and what we learn about them, or the Karamazovs in this chapter?
Oh, I don't think so. Especially, sorry, I missed what other people said. So let's just move on.
I felt like this Rakitin's take on things was probably very skewed, cynical, as I think Jason said. But I feel like it also provided some exposition. Like, I didn't know what relationship this person had or what this person. So even like taking his opinions with a grain of salt, I was like, oh, you're actually explaining things. This is really
helpful.
good. So I'm not sure if I have much of a take on his attitude because my brain was just trying to catch up with the plot while he was explaining things.
I'll make my couple comments and observations, I suppose. I think Rakitin here brings out an interesting side of Alyosha's character, and we haven't seen very much of Alyosha yet doing anything. But I do find it kind of pretty interesting that when Rakitin starts talking about Karamazov's sensuality and women's little feet and all this kind of stuff, Alyosha interrupts him and says, I understand that. Like, he seems to get it. I think Alyosha actually concedes a lot of what Rakitin is saying at certain points. And it's sort of some blushing admissions and so forth. He also admits to having imagined a crime in his head when the elder bows before Dmitri. I'm now realizing we completely forgot to talk about Dmitri in the whole scene.
Right.
Whoops.
Dmitri.
We'll backtrack to that. But I just found it interesting that Alyosha basically acknowledges, okay, some of these terrible thoughts did occur in my head. Now that you point that out, yeah, I did think that too. Okay, no one has anything to say about Alyosha. Let's talk about Dmitri. What's that, Aaron?
He's human. What do you?
Right. So I did forget to talk about the whole "Why is such a man alive?" chapter, where here is the drama. Here's Moripovich in the monastery. Feel free to talk about Dmitri, about Fyodor, anything that came up after Ivan gets out of the way with his intellectual stuff and the drama starts going down. Anybody have some observations, or what's your reactions to Dmitri?
Oh, cat. Technically not Dmitri, but it is this chapter. And in terms of tracking funny things in this book, I think one of my favorites is, or in this chapter, is Fyodor's weird obsession with Schiller's play or opera, The Robbers, that he keeps bringing up. And it is, again, like someone who like read it like a couple weeks ago, and is desperate to sort of insert it into every conversation, which is a trait of people we all know, and sometimes are. I enjoyed that bit.
But have you read Brothers Karamazov?
Exactly.
Well, it's reminding me of that BuzzFeed thing I brought up earlier, right? Like, which of Schiller's characters are you? Like, it's totally that impulse. And then the fact that he's doing it in a monastery, right? To me, it felt like if I was at church and I'd be like quoting like the Sex and the City, or like, well, she's the Samantha in the group, and she's just being such a Carrie, and the priest is like, what? Okay, maybe that reference was lost on most of you, but
I got it.
Thank you. Thank
got it.
you. I could do Game of Thrones instead if that's more timely.
I'd actually get that less than the Sex and the City joke.
And we've learned something about Aaron. We haven't.
How many seasons are there in Sex and the City, Aaron?
I think 10, right?
Jesus.
No, I'm pretty sure it's only 6.
All right, I want to point something about Dmitri out. This is a small detail.
I think it is not 10. I have no idea.
Maybe significant. So just talking about, again, the kind of proprieties that people observe when they enter the monastery. Dmitri is the only one out of all these Karamazovs who does directly go straight to the elder, ask his blessing, seems to show deference, comes in trying to be polite and respectful to everyone, makes a bow to everybody, and seems to be actually trying to be well-behaved and good-natured. And maybe is there for a good purpose. Like, he seems to be the only one.
Yeah.
Well, ostensibly, wasn't he invited, basically Fyodor invited / challenged him, like, hey, let's go resolve our dispute in front of the elder. So in a way, he kind of has the most to gain or lose by this. Whereas like Ivan and Miasov, they're just there, I don't know, to poke intellectual fun at things and not to actually settle a dispute or try and resolve. I mean, obviously there's a lot going on with the invitation, but I think from the book we read last week, it was originally like kind of the idea was to try and resolve the dispute between Fyodor and Dmitri.
Yes, and Dmitri seems to be the only one who remembers that.
Right, or cares, or
right.
Acknowledges it, or at least tries to make a good impression.
Yeah, and I wondered, because he was told the time by a servant sent by Fyodor, if the reason he was late was because Fyodor was trying to just tell him the wrong time, just to make him look like an idiot.
I noticed that too. I thought so. I thought that was probably purposeful.
Yeah, it was Fyodor's servant, Smerdikov, who seems to have misinformed him about the time, or at least that's what Dmitri is claiming. Is it an excuse, or is it what really happened? We don't know, but Smerdikov does continue to play a role in the book. I hadn't actually noticed that little detail until I reread it today, and I thought, oh, maybe he did get set up.
I mean, since it seems to be Fyodor's aim to just make everything a circus, telling Dmitri the wrong time seems like that could legit be a part of that plan.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that was what you were saying, McGee. It seems like Dimitri's one of the only ones that wants to behave. And partly, again, I'm reading this through like my own lenses and experiences here, but it seems like Fyodor is just like, he kind of enjoys provoking Dmitri because Dmitri gets so mad. You know, like I do think they have a real dispute about money and this woman and all this other stuff going on. But sometimes it seems like Fyodor just like wants to egg him on. Like Dmitri, it's weird, like, 'cause he gets so angry and multiple times he yells or he admits like there's this captain he beat up about money, or like he admits he has a temper. He's not trying to say he's a good guy, but it seems like he really does come in sometimes trying to behave, and then Fyodor is just like, all right, here we go, let's work him up, you know, and then eventually Dmitri explodes.
Kind of like Miasov, only in
Right.
totally different ways for different reasons. But
Right, like instead of messing with his self-importance, he messes with his temper and just gets him to blow.
And in case anyone has forgotten, Miasov actually did adopt Dmitri from Fyodor. He was the one that took him in, if you remember, and then ditched him again. But he's like his guardian. Anyone have any other observations about that chapter, or is it pretty much just like, okay, that was some drama?
We haven't talked about one of the most important moments, how the whole thing comes to an end when Father Zosima bows down in front of Dmitri, which everyone, it's like the record scratch, right? It's like everyone is like, what just happened? And yeah. Was that a record scratch?
Or a closet door.
I mean, not having read the book before, I was pretty much at a loss as to what that meant. And I mean, we sort of got a theory about it in the next chapter with the guy whose name starts with an R, who I can't remember for 5 seconds, even though we've been talking about him the whole night. Rakitin, yeah. I mean, we kind of got his take on what it meant and a little bit of Alyosha's, but I pretty much had no guesses or theories.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm rereading. I didn't remember what Rakitin said, so I'm looking back over it.
So Rakitin basically says, what was that all about? That's just some kind of big show. He senses something and it's some kind of prophecy, you know. Although interestingly, Rakitin is the one making most of the prophecies here.
Yeah, but he says it's a prophecy about the murder.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, which is Rakitin's prophecy.
Oh, that's right. I can't find the page, but Rakitin ends up saying something, right? Like, well, if he bows to him and this happens, then they'll claim Y. And if he bows to him and something else happens, then they'll claim Z. So no matter what, by bowing, he looks super awesome, right? That's basically Rakitin's sort of skeptical take on it. Cool.
Yeah, it's towards the bottom of page 78. I just found it.
Yay, thanks, Jenny.
He smelled crime. It stinks in your family. What crime? Rakitin evidently wanted to speak his mind. A crime in your nice little family. It'll take place between your dear brothers and your nice rich papa. So Father Zosima bumps his forehead on the ground for the future, just in case. Afterwards, they'll say, it's what the holy elder foretold, prophesied. Or they'll say it was an emblem or an allegory or et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think what's particularly interesting about that scene is not even the bow as much as what happens after it. Dmitri Fyodorovich stood dumbstruck for a few moments, bowing at his feet. What was that? Then suddenly he cried out, "Oh God!" and covering his face with his hands, rushed from the room. So what was that about, too? Like, was that just embarrassment, or like this whole scene is no longer bearable, and what have I gotten myself into? Or, you know, it's hard to say for sure, but it's interesting that he seems to have a strong reaction to that. I think we don't really know enough about the characters at this point in the book to make much of it. Maybe. Did you have anything you wanted to say, Melissa?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed it is significant, but like I said before, I'm pretty clueless. I'm just sort of waiting to see what significance it has.
So the only section we haven't explicitly talked about is Scandal, the last chapter with the dinner. And I want to, if anyone has observations to share about that or parts that they particularly enjoyed, this is another kind of funny scene. Chime in and we'll wrap up our discussion.
Very cool. I'm going to have to leave you to examine Scandal on your own. What is it? Forgive me, but I am expected elsewhere. Goodbye. That sort of thing. Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Bye, Jason.
Night.
This is what teaching an English class is like a lot.
Economics too.
Yeah, cool.
Well, I think we've talked through the big ideas already and cited some of the funny scenes at 11:30 at night could be a factor as well. So
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say is I'm just getting tired. My brain's slow.
Yeah, I crammed this. I really need to do the reading earlier in the week so my brain has time to process it for next week. And we already sort of talked about the guy being pushed out of the carriage as being hilarious.
I did laugh out loud really hard when Fyodor bursts back into the room and is like, haha, you thought I had left, but now I'm here. Like that part's hilarious.
They're all just drama queens.
Yeah.
It's like I thought I was gonna leave.
I really love when he bursts in like that and Pyotr Alexandrovich Miasov, from a most benign mood, immediately turned ferocious. All that had just died out and grown quiet in his heart instantly resurrected and rose up. No, this I cannot bear. I absolutely cannot, and I simply cannot.
That's classic situational comedy, right? He's like, oh, I'm just going to let the lawsuit go. Everything is fine. And then here he is.
I just can't even.
I mean, this is absolutely one of Fyodor's worst lines. Normally he's funny and witty, or it's like he couldn't even think of anything. He's like, and I'm back.
Well, and then when Miasov is like, okay, well, if you're here, then I'm leaving. And Fyodor just straight up is like, no, if you leave, I'm coming with you. If you stay, I'm going to be here. I'm just going to be annoying you no matter what you do. That's my sole purpose right now, is to personally annoy you and terrorize you. He pretty much says that.
Yeah, you're right. You're totally right.
It says when you marry someone, you marry their family, right? That's the big point, I think. I also found the reference to tickling very funny and out of place and confusing. I just didn't ever think there was going to be anything about tickling in this book. That was much earlier.
Aaron?
That was much earlier.
Okay, I thought so. When he's telling himself as here's even when I did something to my own harm.
Yes, page 41. Yes, I said I did tickle her, and at that he gave me quite a tickling.
That's almost like Shakespearean euphemisms right there.
Yeah, I was like, oh, will I be getting a tickling tonight? No, I will not.
Thank you, YouTube. You now.
Back to something I pointed out earlier. Did I just miss something?
No, that was just one of our classic interactions, McG.
I wasn't paying attention, Aaron. I don't know what happened there.
Precisely.
No, it's just you had the air of a teacher being like, okay, class, let's get back on track now.
Sorry. As I've mentioned before, like Fyodor like just keeps quoting religious stuff, and I like find this pretty funny, and maybe this takes some insider Orthodox knowledge to know, but like when he kind of gets fed up and has to make his exit, and this is almost a bit Trump-like. It's like he has to find some problem and blame other people for it so he can leave, you know? But he just starts like saying, oh, you know, I'm Alexi's father. I'm concerned for his soul. You guys aren't doing things right in this monastery. Like, you hear confession out loud, that's like non-canonical. And he starts going on this like, this is like kind of basically fundamentalist objections that he absolutely doesn't believe whatsoever, but they're totally like these bizarre fundamentalist objections. Half the time he doesn't even know what he's talking about. And I also love when, back to Ginny's point about how like, my mission in life now is to severely and supremely annoy Miasov. Like, another favorite part of mine there is when he's saying, he calls him his relative, and Miasov gets like really pissed off. He's like, we are not related and never have been. And Fyodor's like, oh, yes, we are. I can prove it by the church calendar. Which proves absolutely nothing, but like, yeah, we're related, man. You can't get rid of me.
I like that the narrator actually wrote like nota bene. This is crap.
Yes.
Yeah, in this chapter that was probably the most ridiculous, there were 2 nota benes.
Okay, guys. Well, is there anything that we skipped over or that anyone else want to talk about? Any topic that, you know, you were hoping we could cover before we wrap up?
There was one thing throughout reading this book, and maybe it's just because I watched The Matrix like a week ago, but I felt like Father Zosima in some ways was a lot like the Oracle in The Matrix, where he didn't necessarily give people the answers that they wanted, but he told them what they needed to hear at the time.
But he didn't give him a cookie, which is disappointing.
I was just gonna say that.
But he did say, more or less, don't worry about the vase. Not in so many words, but...
Melissa, I would say the Elder was more neutral good and the Oracle's more neutral neutral. Is that fair?
I am definitely too tired to talk about character alignments. Oh my gosh. And I've not had nearly enough alcohol to get into it with you again, Aaron.
Sorry.
I like that assessment, David. I think that's actually a helpful way to think about it. I don't think that's off base at all. All right, we're done.
Sorry.
Thank you, everyone. I thought that was an excellent discussion. I learned a lot myself. I think we're doing great on these, and I think it's just impressive how deep we can dig as a group, and y'all are thinking of stuff that I haven't thought of and putting it really well. And you know, I'm reading this book for like the 4th time now. I just finished it, and I'm reading it again now at the pace of the group, and I'm getting more out of it as a result.
Overachiever.
So I hope you all are enjoying this, and we'll see you next week for book 3. All right.
Woohoo.